Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I've never been to Helena, and it is beautiful. I've been to Butte now. I think this is my third trip to Butte. I've been on the back of a motorcycle in Missoula, so I never got to see Missoula until this week. But my description was right on because I did see the street that's very important in the book, and we'll be talking about that in just a minute. Frank Little is my great-grandfather's youngest brother. He was 17 years younger than my great-grandfather. So he actually was more of a peer with my grandpa. And that's the connection. So I am the great-grand-niece, which is really confusing to people because we usually just say great-niece or great-uncle, but that's actually that's an inaccurate description. So what I'm going to do tonight is I want to tell you some things that you don't know about Frank Little. I want to tell you how you can have a skeleton in your family closet, because that's what Frank was. He was the skeleton in the family closet. I wanted to know more about him, primarily because of this, and we'll see if I've got this right, this cartoon. Back in 2001, my son, who was taking advanced placement, AP United States History, walked into my office and he said, "Mom," he said, "isn't that our uncle?" And I looked at the cartoon and I said, "Yes, that's your uncle." What's missing here is the caption. I don't have the caption on here, but the guy that's wearing the mask and the big black hat is labeled as the Copper Trust. The man who's receiving the money is the press, and the caption is, "That's okay, pal, just tell him he's a traitor." That cartoon sums up everything about Frank Little. So the information that we have known historically about Frank is he went to Butte, Montana, and he was hanged. And it was probably Anaconda Mining Company that did it. That's what everybody knows. Frank only was in Montana, in Butte, 13 days. He'd been in Kalispell years before. He had been in Missoula, but in Butte, Montana, he was only there for 13 days. But Butte, that's what we think of when we think of Frank Little. We think of Butte, Montana. Well, I knew then my son was supposed to write this document-based essay. It's called a DBQ, and for college credit, the course, and it was to explain this cartoon and this connection. And I realized that as a student going through school myself, and even my minor was in history because I've always loved history, that we never got the information about this time period that we should have. Most courses were kind of a survey course. And so I knew I had to go back and I had to find out why my family had stopped talking about Frank, and they had. When I was a teenager, we would have my great aunts who knew him, who were close to his same age, would be at the house. We'd be going through the boxes, and I'd hear them say something about Uncle Frank. And finally, one of them, I said, "Well, wait a minute, what about Uncle Frank? Why don't we have a picture?" We had no photos. And they said, "Well, he was a socialist. He was hanged from a telephone pole." And one of the things I found out is that when you have family anecdotes that come down through history, anecdotes kind of get stretched. There's always a tiny seed of truth. Yes, he was a socialist. He wasn't a member of the Socialist Party, but he was definitely a socialist in ideology. And he was hanged from a railroad trestle. And I had another uncle who was a Cripple Creek miner who married this woman named Emma from Arizona. And that was also hush-hush. I didn't know why. So I decided I would tell the story. And I didn't get into telling the story until I finally retired from teaching in 2008. And then I started. And that was 9 years ago. It took me 7 years to do all the research. Frank was in Oklahoma, he was in Kansas, he was in Missouri, he was in Minnesota, he was in Wisconsin, he was in Colorado, he was in Montana, he was in Nevada, he was in Washington State, California, and Arizona. I had to go every one of those places. And that took a while. My first trip was to Oklahoma, where we did until just a few years ago have the family homestead that my great-grandfather had done in the Oklahoma Land Run. I hadn't been back in like 25 years. And on that trip, I was hit by a car. Standing outside my car doing the research, a lady T-boned me right into the car. That was a setback, but we did the trip anyway. There was a tornado in another town. We just hit the town just before we went through it, and fires were horrible that season. I had my first asthma attack ever. So if anybody was trying to tell me, don't do this, that was it, but I persevered and we did it. And so it ended up that all the rest of the journeys were great. I was able to get wonderful research, and it had to be primary research. Tomorrow when I speak at the Missoula Book Fest, I'm on a panel about historical research. And one of the things that is tricky for someone like me is I'm a family member. And, people say, well, yeah, but she's a family member and she wrote the book. It's not a mommy dearest book, but she wrote the book, but it's just going to be family stuff. I had to go back and I had to search out all the primary information. That means I had to go find the start of the story, as it were. And the University of Oklahoma Press accepted my book, and one of the comments on there was, how much scholarly research did she use? The problem with some of the scholarly research is that the scholars who did it, the first guy that got the research, might have gotten it wrong. And then the rest of the scholars just copied it. So I had to go back and I had to look at all those sources that they used. I had to go back and then find those sources myself and evaluate them. So it took me a long time. And so here I am today, and I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm going to share some of what I found out. And again, this is going to be just a portion of what is in this book, because he did so much, and I think I have it down to almost every day of his life, just about. So I'm going to put this one up, and I think you know that one. I'm going to incorporate some readings while I discuss what some of this means. And what I always start out with in the beginning of this book when I do these is the prologue. This is the only part in the book that is not documented. But this is what everybody knows. And again, I had to go to the newspapers. I actually contacted the landlord's family in Ireland to get information. But I didn't need to document this because this is a story you know. But being the old English teacher in me, I tried to write it so it would read a little bit differently than just a boring history book. In the early morning hours of August 1st, 1917, a black Cadillac snaked slowly up North Wyoming Street from an old delivery barn below the hill in Butte, Montana. The weather had been arid and unusually warm, and tempers were heated as well. But in the serene coolness of night, there was an aural crispness, a heavy silence that descended on the city after days of strikers' demands for safer working conditions and fair employment. Days after the great speculator mine had swallowed 168 miners in fire and toxic fumes. The Butte town was exhausted and anxious. 6 men quietly slid out of the idling car. One stood sentry while the other 5 entered a boarding house at 316 North Wyoming Street. Some said the men wore uniforms. Others remembered indistinct attire, but all agreed that the 6 men, anonymous behind their masquerade masks and cloaked in darkness, were on a sinister assignment. Once inside, they crept to a downstairs room and violently kicked in the door, shattering the silence, only to find the room empty. Someone muttered, "A mistake somewhere." The men, apparently armed with misinformation from one of the many paid informants, or stoolies, hired by mine agents, moved to the next door in the hall. While throwing on her robe, landlady Nora Byrne heard their frustrated, muffled voices just before her own door opened, several inches, a large pistol penetrating the darkness above the bed. A flashlight obscured the intruders momentarily from her sleepy eyes. A muted voice identified the speaker as a law officer, while the man with the menacing pistol demanded in loud whispers that Mrs. Byrne tell them which room Frank Little occupied. She murmured that Frank was renting room 32, next to the room they had just entered. Frank surely heard the door splintering at the same time Mrs. Byrne was awakened by the ruckus. He knew what was about to transpire, as he had received numerous threats and beatings in the past. As Frank reached for his pocket watch, he was roughly yanked out of bed, the watch rattling across the wood floor. Wearing only his underwear and a plaster cast protecting a broken ankle, Frank, oddly enough, reached next for his hat. But he was told he would not need it where he was going. By then, he could make no response since the captors had gagged his mouth with a towel. Only Mrs. Byrne and her 2 other boarders timidly peered through the doors to witness what was taking place. A struggling tenant dragged out of the boarding house to a waiting car. And typical of many bystanders, they provided Frank with no immediate assistance, waiting at least half an hour before calling local authorities. Frank twisted and thrashed, but with a broken ankle and 6 men restraining him, he was easily gathered up and thrown into the back seat where side curtains hid the crime. The beating had already begun, though the result would be different from the assaults he had received before. The black sedan drove back south down Wyoming Street, stopping abruptly just before it turned west into Butte's business district. Wrenching Frank out of the Cadillac, his assailants tied him to the rear bumper and drove several more blocks, towing him in the car's wake over the granite paved streets. Both of Frank's kneecaps were nearly ripped away, his toes and fingers reduced to bloody pulp, but he was still alive. When the car was within sight of the Milwaukee Railroad trestle about 2 miles south of town, it turned west onto a sandy road that led near a bridge. The car stopped directly underneath it, next to where a rope thrown over the ties above dangled an invitation. Someone quickly pinned a pasteboard placard on the right thigh of Frank's dirtied underwear and scribbled in blood-red crayon the message read, "Others take notice. First and last warning, 3777." And this is the placard right here. The numbers referring to, of course, the old Montana Vigilante Code. Added in lead pencil were the initials LDCSSWT with the L circled. The men grasped Frank's body, pistol whipped and now mangled from the dragging, and heaved him on top of the big black car. Between glimmers of awareness and flutters of darkened consciousness, Frank must have felt the rough noose squeeze around his neck. Perhaps he could not command his body to struggle as a surreal heaviness hugged his brain while he slipped into nothingness. The assassin car suddenly moved forward, leaving Frank's slender frame to swing about 5 feet above the ground. Then the mysterious hitmen erased the evidence of their tracks and fled in their big black car, while Franklin Henry Little, youngest son of a quintessential American family, asphyxiated alone at the end of a hemp rope. So that's the beginning. And you know that. And all of these details, of course, were in Bureau of Investigation reports, in reporters who had to do testimony in the 1918 IWW trial, and in the newspapers. And so that's how I was able to put that together. Okay. All right. This is Frank's father, my great-great-grandfather. He was a doctor. He became a doctor at 40 years old. Participated in the land run when he was 50, which is unbelievable, but it's pretty typical about what happened in Oklahoma. And one of the things I want to do tonight, and I'm trying to watch my time to make sure I can do this just right, I want to connect 3 states. I just told you all the states that Frank was with, but I want to connect Oklahoma, Arizona, and, of course, Montana tonight. Because I know that the Historical Society last week, they were talking about 1917, about the war, and so I really want to tie these three states together, because I think I have some information that might be people don't know about. He did participate in the land run in 1889, and the reason he did was he was part of a group of people that, at least I know one historian has called them failures, and I went back and I looked, and when you look at Oklahoma, in the land run, it was a generation after the Civil War. People had not done well. Reconstruction had not been good, in the South at least, and this family was from Illinois. And they saw a chance that they had moved to Missouri, and Missouri had been torched and torn apart because you had Quantrill's Raiders, and then after Quantrill's Raiders, you had the military coming in, you had punishment for being Confederate sympathizers and so forth. And so the people went into Missouri, and then they kept thinking, well, this land is going to open up. It's going to open up. In my family, they were what were called intruders. They actually went into Oklahoma Indian Territory. It was actually just called Indian Territory. And they weren't supposed to be there. It was totally against the law. So we were lawbreakers right from the beginning. And so this is what happened. And so Frank Little took the notion that he was part Indian, which is kind of true. And I'll tell that in just a minute. And I think that was the biggest shock for the people in Butte, is he was not half American Indian. Not half Indian, half white, all IWW, which is what he told people. He is wearing the Native American garb, and this is actually in their cabin on the banks of the Cimarron River. But as far as the failures go, a lot of these people that came is because they had lost everything, and they thought they could get this free land. There were people who came out of the country. There were British and Irish and Germans who came also and participated in the run. The problem is that they didn't have the successes. And one thing that's real important on Frank's story is that in Oklahoma, prior to this, the first corporations in Oklahoma were cattle companies, and they were leasing the land from the American Indians. They had a sweet arrangement with the government and the Indians, and they were owned by Irish companies and Scottish companies and British companies. A lot of money to be made there. And so here comes my family. And since you are from Montana and you don't know this, what did I do with my book? I know, there it is. Let me read this for you. This is a land run, and I have seen this particular photo as either the land run of 1889, in which my family participated, or it's the next one 2 years later. There's actually contradictory information out there on this particular land run. But I want to read this to you because this is what my great-great-grandfather participated in while Frank was standing on the sidelines, and what my great-grandfather participated in. And as I do this, you will understand why my uncle became a radical. So, I mean, that was one of the questions. Why did my family stop talking about him? And how in the world did we produce a radical? I wanted to know. Okay. Oklahomans were radicals. Okay, much has been written describing the excitement and motley participants in the 1889 land run. On a beautiful cloudless day, mounted blue-coated soldiers stood guard over scores of people, nervous riders on skittish horses, calmer drivers in sturdy wagons, and all species of buggies angling for advantageous positions. And then there were people on foot. The Santa Fe Railroad, it stood ready to carry carloads of future Oklahomans into the race. With instructions to the engineers to travel no faster than a horse or a wagon, men and women could leap off the train to stake their claims. My great-grandmother is Elmira. While Elmira, Fred, Frank, Bessie, the little sister, waded safely to the northeast in Indian Territory, both Walter, my great-great-grandfather, and Lon, my great-grandfather, anticipated the race where they too would stake lands that had previously been explored and selected for their homesteads. At noon, cavalry bugles trumpeted in cacophonous unison, and guns fired into a cerulean sky, now tinged red from hooves churning prairie dirt in restless anticipation. And if you've been to Oklahoma, you know the dirt is red. It's quite red. The run had officially begun. Clouds of dust filled the air as people raced pell-mell, as you see here, for their choice claims. And in that frantic melee, Walter successfully staked lots within what would become the Clayton Township in territorial Payne County. The lots fringed the west and northwest side of the Cimarron River, adjacent to a popular crossing before bridges were built. Evidently, he had claimed that land for investment and not for farming. Well, he was too old. I mean, he was 50 years old. Like Walter, Lon, my great-grandfather, staked his own claim, but not far from the starting line because something happened to his horse. So Lon could not race to the property that he had scouted earlier. Instead, when shots were discharged for the run to begin, amid thundering hooves and excited shouts and frenzied screams, Lon simply walked a short distance west and he planted his stake. And so the land run line is, right on our property line. This area was within the future Pawnee Township, also Payne County. Campfires dotted the prairies the night of April 22nd, 1889, and the tent city of Guthrie erupted by morning. Blisters of white canvas tents spreading over russet red dirt and trampled grass town lots. Guthrie would serve as the unofficial capital of Oklahoma Territory, a place for filing claims at a land office, a place to hang medical and legal shingles, a place to make money from selling the essential supplies that 89ers would need to establish their farms. So this was it almost sounds like the beginning of a boom town, and we are going to have boom towns in Oklahoma because it's going to be because of oil. But you can see how excited they were. They're going to have this new life, and then it just didn't work out quite that way. Okay. Now, one of the things I found out, well, I'd already known stories growing up about my great-great-grandfather. He doctored the outlaws in Oklahoma. He was their go-to man. The Dalton family lived next to the Little family in Missouri. My great-great-grandfather was already doctoring up there. The Dalton family also came to Oklahoma. The same time, only they were in Kingfisher County, which is different from Payne County. And so as it was, Oklahoma, they were there in 1889. There was a panic in 1893. These people are not making money. Immediately, you get this push from the United States. We need to come in there. We're going to organize it. We want to make it into a state. The farmers are trying very, very hard to raise crops. Animals, there was a drought. The animals had to be shot. They died. It was just a bad situation. The government tried to bring in food for them, and a lot of them were too proud to take the food. But then there were the outlaws. So when the Doolin-Dalton, or the Dalton gang, and then later the Doolin-Dalton gang became popular, at least in the area where my family lived, the notion was, oh, well, yeah, they're robbing the banks, and they're robbing the trains, and they're robbing, all those big corporate interests. And that is a notion that started in my family. And I'd heard that all my life. I knew, we have a medical journal where my great-great-grandfather took a bullet out of one of these outlaws. He'd set their legs. He'd gone to their hideouts. Frank was in that household. So what I found out is this, we call it social banditry. It has a direct influence on the industrial revolutionaries that came out of Oklahoma and so forth. It was this notion that it was big government against us, and they're not letting us be able to do it, not helping us. Instead, they're sending in these corporations. And if truth be told, what was going on is these cattle corporations wanted that land back. And as each one of these farmers folded and they couldn't hang on to their farms, they were there ready. And because they were not allowed to participate in the land runs. So they waited until a farmer went under, and then they would go buy that property for a cheap amount of money. And guess what? That's what happened in my family. So I'm starting to find out the story on why my uncle had these notions. So the Dalton gang, they're important. And this is, I'm not even there. That's them. That is Emmett Dalton standing on his horse right there. That's Bill Dalton back there. These are pictures from my family. We had them. So we have family pictures of them as well. So the other person that affected my uncle was his brother, Fred Little. Fred took off. He left. He went to Cripple Creek, became a gold miner. And, of course, this idea now, we've got miners that are miners also going against the mining companies. It was just a natural transition to go from Oklahoma to go to Colorado, because at this point we're changing the standard back to gold instead of silver. That is what had caused the panic in 1893. Was because of the silver standard and the overbuilding of railroads. And they were advertising in Oklahoma to come to Colorado. Gold is everywhere. You can get rich. And so he went. He was born in 1875. Frank was born in 1878. He was his superior, in age 3 years. He took off. Frank is left at home with his little sister. That's it. Everybody else is gone. His father is old. Frank's having to do a lot of the work on the farm. And here's Fred supposedly having the time of his life. But I want to give you a statistic, and this will help you understand why you had this with people where or at least in my family, where you have this notion of going against corporations, okay? In 1890, 90% of the families, American families, were living on less than $100 a month. Whereas what we were taught in school, they were called the robber barons. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Carnegie owned $1 trillion, just those three families, at today's rates, whereas 90% of these people at this time were earning less than $100. Also, you had to have a family economy to survive now, so you had children who had to go to work. And we know that by 1900, 20% of the labor force were kids under 18, and we didn't have any child labor laws. We know that these American workers became poor. The artisans, they were being pushed further west because you had all this mechanization, you have all these factories. And so mining, thinking that you can actually go discover your own gold that's kind of attractive. But what happened is when they got into Colorado, they ended up working for an absentee-owned mine. And a lot of these absentee owners, of course, were these same people up in New York and whatever. And so you can see how these attitudes kind of change. This is Fred, and he led Frank into hard rock mining. He was the one who got Frank into mining. And of course, by this point, Fred had joined the Western Federation of Miners, which says, you know, they start off with labor creates all wealth. And of course, that is the very words that go into the preamble for the industrial workers of the world. And that's the socialist. The Western Federation of Miners were very much socialist and actually had become, with later, when the Socialist Labor Party and Socialist Party of America formed, became members of that. So, there's going to be a lot of squabbles that happen later, but let me share that with you. I had to go to, obviously, Arizona. I'm going to be talking about Arizona. This is the Copper Queen Hotel. Frank shows up in 1903. He had been in California. He followed his brother Fred to California mining, left San Francisco, and I find him in 1903 at the Copper Queen Hotel, which he couldn't afford. But I knew when he got off the train, I knew who he was with, I knew who he signed in behind. I knew that where they went later. This is the Copper Queen Hotel today. It was the fanciest hotel you can imagine. It was built to get the investors there in Bisbee, Arizona. So my first trip after Oklahoma was to go to Bisbee because I wanted to find out about the miners and I wanted to find out more about Frank. I actually went inside the mine. I know lots of you have been inside mines, but what's different about this particular mine, which is the Copper Queen, this is the mine that these fellas are in, is that you actually go into the mine about 1,500 to 2,000 feet. You really go into the mine. And we had to wear the hard hats, and we had the lights and the battery packs, and it's 45 degrees, which is unusual. It was a cold mine. And they had former Phelps Dodge employees that were the tour guides. And of course, I'd already talked to this one guy, and all the way we'd be going along, and he'd stop the train at a jolt, and he goes, "Where's the lady writing the book?" And every time he'd stop, I'd try not to drop my pencil or what I was writing with. But he told me that photos were not allowed to be taken inside the mines. You were not allowed to take pictures. This photo had to have been done very stealthily, or it was at the orders of Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation. They didn't want people to see the safety conditions, the working conditions inside the mines. And that's one of the stories he told me about the mine. When Frank started, they were wearing soft hats, and they were using candles for illumination, and of course, that's what is on this guy's head. Frank later came back when the speculator mine incident happened, which was over a carbide lantern that touched an oily cable. He came back and he said, well, you need to get rid of those. You need to go back to candles. But I got to tell you, doesn't that look dangerous too, having the candles just lit there? So I'm not sure about that reasoning. Okay. Frank became a member of the Western Federation of Miners, not in Bisbee, because Bisbee was a white man's camp. A white man's camp means that nobody of Eastern origin who had darker skin, definitely not Mexicans or Mexican Americans, no blacks, no Native Americans, you were not allowed to work in the mine. Professor Douglas, who owned the company, was successful in keeping the Western Federation of Miners out. Frank next showed up in Globe. He went straight from there to Globe. And in Globe, he joined the Socialist Party. He became a member of the Western Federation of Miners. And I guess they saw somebody that had a lot of passion, who could talk really well. I'm not sure they saw something in him. He was very young. And they decided, the AFL, they're getting something in on us. We need to get in there and go ahead and get these Mexicans organized. They didn't want to, but that's what they decided. None of them wanted to do it. But that boy from Oklahoma, he has no problem with it. So this was Frank's first foray into organizing, and it was an absolute failure. So I want to read that to you. Let me find my page. And I'm going to read, you'll see why. Saturday evening, October 1st, 1904, an orphan train sponsored by the Sisters of Charity Foundling Hospital in New York City shuddered to a stop before the old Coronado Trail in Clifton, Arizona. 40 bewildered children, exhausted by their 6-day journey, woke with a start. The littlest lay in the comforting arms of nuns and nurses who had accompanied them, while others peered uncertainly out of the boxcar windows. Clifton would be a terminus for 16 of 40 children who had journeyed from the Grand Central Station for placement in devout Catholic homes. The others would meet their new families next morning in Morenci, a tortuous corkscrew climb about 1,000 feet above Clifton. This is commonly called the Clifton-Morenci Mining District, and Clifton is still there today. Metcalf was the other mining camp. This is all leads up to this, and only Clifton is there today. At the stop awaited a cluster of Clifton's Anglo women curious about the orphan trains that had been delivering waifs all over the West. What they saw encouraged them to adopt. The nuns had dressed the little girls in starched white frocks, their hair curled and beribboned. The little boys made their Clifton debut in stylish sailor suits, incongruous with the dry, rusty red mountains looming above. The women pressed forward, eager to pick out children, unaware that new foster families already had been picked. That evening, at the wooden-framed Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Copper Street, today's Chase Street, darkly shawled foster mothers obediently formed a queue to collect children matched to their Clifton Catholic homes. Observers noted that all 16 children were fair-skinned with Irish surnames, and all new mothers were brown-skinned. In fact, the new parents mostly came from mining families who earned a Mexican wage of $1.50 to $2.50 a day. I want to tell you that in 1903 in Arizona, they passed a law that all the miners got $3 for an 8-hour day, but not if you were Mexican. Next day in Morenci, after the last child was placed into the arms of a Mexican family, a tempest erupted, as wicked as a thunderstorm wrecking a Morenci miners' strike the year before. And just like the flood of racism that had led to that 1903 miners' strike, this new conflict was built on a foundation of extreme prejudice. During another downpour on the following evening, Morenci and Clifton Anglo women orchestrated a kidnapping from the Mexican mothers, generating mob rule that lasted several days. The Arizona Bulletin condemned Catholics for selling sweet, innocent white American babies to squalid, half-civilized Mexicans of the lowest class. The priest was run out of town for having the stupidity to select parents from an obviously inferior race, and armed vigilantes rescued 19 children, while 21 children barely escaped with the nuns onto a train bound back east. After a failed, brief legal study to return the children to their foster families, the orphans were gathered into the arms of white mothers, while a patriotic band struck up America at their homecoming, and crowds celebrated, yelling until they could yell no more. Such was the racial atmosphere Frank Little entered 9 months later, and his job was to organize Mexican workers who surely had little reason to trust him. And the reason it failed was the first officers, he actually was able to get 2 of the locals organized for the Western Federation of Miners. Morenci would not do it. They were too burned from all of this. But the reason he failed was the officers that they selected within the locals were white. So it was the same thing. You've got these white guys telling us what to do. Why can't we have the Mexicans be elected? And it was a total failure. He learned something from this. And so when we look at this, hang on here, that's Frank's mother. He said, my mother is American Indian. I'm half American Indian. Do you see American Indian there? Actually, Elmira, my great-great-grandmother, is part Indian, but she wasn't half. We know that Frank was probably 1/32. He might have been 1/16. She could have been 1/8 best. I mean, she could have been, 1/8. He could have been 1/16 or 1/32, but he certainly was not half American Indian. So what he did from this time is he kind of took up, well, yeah, I'm half Indian. I'm from Indian territory. And it worked well because if you're organizing immigrants, and if you're organizing people, Mexicans, and when I say immigrants, I'm talking about the Eastern Europeans who came over. Look, they treat us Indians badly too. And when it came part of the IWW, he could say, hey, when the United States government and other unions were against the IWW, because, hey, we are an organic American movement. I'm American Indian. You can't say we're Germans, because it's World War I. So it worked really, really well for him. And for a long time, I just thought, man, I've got a lot of American Indian blood. I don't. I think I'm 164. What is it? Well, 68 times 2, you can do the math. That's probably 64 times 2, that's me. So he's half Indian, half white, but he was all wobbly. Now I'm going to jump to something because this, oops, I just went back. Let me go back. I want to get this cartoon up here because obviously I'm leaving out a lot of his life, right? So I am going to jump to this cartoon real quick. This actually was in 1909. This is a cartoon from the Spokane free speech fight. And I want you to look at it. What do you see there that looks like today? I mean, he says the Lady Liberty says, you certainly have the right of free speech, but you haven't the right to ram it down my ears, not without my consent. If I don't like it, you can't say it. My uncle, I found out that what my uncle contributed the most during his life was not being lynched in Butte, Montana. It was what he did for free speech. And this is the part that is not told. Historians did know somewhat what he did, but they didn't know nearly what all he was involved in as far as free speech. The first it's the first American free speech of any value was actually in Missoula, Montana. This gal, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, she wasn't very old. That's where she went west for her first fight, and it was in Missoula. That is the first American, since the Revolution, that's the first American free speech movement, and definitely the most important one to begin the Western free speech movement. Okay, now this is actually in Paterson, New Jersey at the Silk Strike, but I wanted to show you her. And I wanted to tell you that what Frank pioneered after this is what he is given credit for. These are the same techniques that were used by the Freedom Train riders in the Civil Rights Movement. He perfected the technique of peaceful, nonviolent, free speech protests, not like what we're seeing today. And it's called the four-word speech. Does anybody know what the 4 words were, by any chance? Okay. Downtown Missoula, Montana, buzzed with merchants, patrons, and itinerant workingmen crowding the intersection of Front and Higgins Street on a typically busy September evening. Now, you may know that corner. It's where the Florence Hotel was. That big tall building is there today. I drove by it this morning looking at it again. I love driving by it. Horse-drawn streetcars, stirring dust whirls with plodding hooves, traveled the middle of Higgins Avenue, deftly parting wayward pedestrians. The street's northwest terminus melded into the Northern Pacific Railroad depot and soft golden green hills beyond. Other passerbys traveled southward one short block to where the bridge reconstruction across the Clark River, ongoing almost 12 months now, and financed by copper baron William A. Clark, afforded amateur bridge inspectors endless amusement in what a local newspaper called an open-air vaudeville. The intersection was the heart of Missoula's business district. On the southeast corner of Front and Higgins Avenue, the Queen Anne-style First National Bank was closing its business for the day. Catter-corner stood the Grand Missoula Mercantile Store, its customers picking up last-minute purchases before night fell. Some glanced across the street at a Florence Hotel canopied corner entrance where 4 men and a girl were positioning boxes and barrels beneath a light pole. Already a circle of curious onlookers was forming in anticipation of a repeat performance after 5 orators were arrested for disturbing the peace the night before. Upon further scrutiny, it appeared that the petite, auburn-haired girl was in charge. With one hand, she directed placement of boxes and barrels, while her other arm carried pamphlets, flyers, and newspapers. As she dispensed the scripts to the men involved in the evening soapboxing, police pressed toward the little group and the interested bystanders. 19-year-old Elizabeth Gurley Flynn handed Frank Little his oratorical topic for the evening. It was called On Temperance. Not a surprising treaty, since the IWW had been crusading against alcohol recently. Too many working men were lured into the saloons and prostitution houses where they were rolled of their hard-earned dollars before they could purchase much-needed shoes or clothing. The night before, on September 28, 1909, Frank had prepared a speech. That's today. It's 100 years ago. No, not 100 years ago, but it is today's anniversary. How about that? The night before, September 28, 1909, Frank had prepared a speech on the Colorado labor wars to share with the onlookers, but local police announcing that the mayor had deemed such speeches too radical for the ears of Missoula citizenry warned the soapboxers not to speak. That was a radical topic. The city had just reinstated ordinances against public speaking and street assembly, and of course the street assembly would be your Fourth Amendment. That changed things. At first, the goal had been to educate the masses of workers about capitalist crimes against working men through a series of prepared speeches. But since the soapboxers were hauled down from their oratorical perches as soon as they opened their mouths, organizers had adjusted their protest goals. It was now their intention to fill the jails to capacity and overwhelm the local court system. The fact that the Missoula police were currently in the middle of a campaign to arrest prostitutes and their johns only aided IWW attempts to pack the jails. And though it was not a conventional manner in which to grow membership, organizers hoped to increase awareness of industrial unionism as well as highlight the city's abuse of working men's constitutional rights. The right to speak went hand in hand with the right to organize. So one at a time, the IWW members took a stand at the conspicuous street corner and they began a speech with a customary greeting. No sooner was one arrested than another took his place. Soapbox tag teaming had become an IWW pastime guaranteed to entertain hundreds of people who hoped to hear the fiery speeches and watch city services at work. That would be the fire department showing up with the fire hose. Okay, Frank climbed atop a crate and began what the IWW would call the four-word speech, and that is, fellow workers and friends, he began. And abruptly, before he could elucidate the evils of drink to a growing audience, police yanked him down and arrested him. Flynn's husband, Jack Jones, immediately took Frank's position, and he was arrested. But as George Appleby, a young logger, stepped up and was handcuffed, something curious happened. Herman Tucker, a U.S. Forest Service civil engineer, after watching the ruckus from his office window, rushed downstairs and tried to continue Appleby's attempt at the Declaration of Independence. Then he, too, was arrested. In court the next day, Herman Tucker, Jack Jones, George Appleby, and Frank Little faced Justice of the Peace Harry Small, and Small sentenced the men to 15 days in the county jail after pronouncing them guilty of disturbing the peace despite their protests that they had a constitutional right to make speeches. This was Frank's first experience with the American justice system and first of what would become many protest arrests. And when Small offered immediate freedom to the men, if they suspended their public speaking, they chose to remain in jail and serve out their sentences. This was exactly what Elizabeth Gurley Flynn wanted. She sent out a call through the industrial worker for all footloose rebels to come at once to defend the rights, the Bill of Rights. And straightforward, IWW members began streaming into Missoula, flocking by freight cars, on top, inside, and below. The IWW had just given birth to the technique of free speech fighting in Missoula. I think it was in 2006. I don't know if it was the city council. I don't know which group it was in Missoula, but they dedicated that corner a free speech corner. And I think they were supposed to put a plaque or something up. It's not there. I don't know what happened. But that was the first thing I went to go check when I got here. This is actually in San Diego. San Diego is one of the worst free speech fights there was. They take credit that this was the first time that the fire department used the fire hose on people. No, it was in Missoula. Missoula was the first time that they used the fire hose, and there were even reports of a baby getting seriously, if not fatally, injured from the fire hose hitting the infant. It was not good, but they won that free speech fight. Now, I want to say something because this wasn't in part of my book. Part of my discussion tonight. But the IWW formed in 1905. The Western Federation of Miners became an arm of the Industrial Workers of the World, and at that point, they had taken that belief about labor, which you produce, belongs to all, and they had changed things that the AFL did not do, and Western federations had not been doing, and that is that they accepted all ethnicities, all colors of people, all genders, and they accepted workers who were not skilled. And so you can see when people are starving and the abuses that were going on in the mining industry in particular, it was very, very attractive to them. And so that's why the IWW got so popular at that time. And in Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma became so radical that it had the largest socialist structure of any state in the country, was Oklahoma. You know, it's red Republican today, but it was red socialist then. And it did a quick flip about 1917. It's just amazing the flip it did. But those poor farmers in Oklahoma, the Populist Party, the Working Men's Party, the Farmers Alliance, all these groups that were really not the populists, but the others were kind of a radical group at first because they were balking at everything. And then when Oklahoma became a state in 1907, that changed things. Because now you've got your Republican Party and Democrat Party who are going to come in, and in this case it was the Democrat Party came in and they were very strong, and so Oklahoma starts changing. But you had that radical attitude. My family were Republicans. They had come from Illinois. They had fought on the Union side of the war. They were Republicans and went into that state, and gosh, look what happened, how they changed. And it was because of what was going on in the country, and in particularly in Oklahoma. So now we're in the free speech fights that the IWW was known for. This one, of course, the Missoula is so important. Frank next went to Spokane, Washington, and each time he was jailed, things got a little bit worse. In this particular one, they had so many people arrested, they did an overflow and put them in this old abandoned school. And in one instance, they were starved. It was freezing. It was in the winter. They didn't have hardly anything to eat. They had bread and water. That's what they had. They had bread and water. And so scurvy was in there. In one instance, one onion made it in. There were 60 men in there and divided up one onion. It was horrible, and his health started getting bad. I can't even begin to tell you how many times he was beat up. I know that he was mock hanged once before he was really hanged. He was kidnapped 3 times, and he was beaten numerous times. In fact, when they were doing the coroner's report in Butte, they were having a hard time determining what were the injuries from actually being, what I read there in the prologue, what those injuries were compared to injuries he had just received a few months, well, actually probably about 6 or 7 months earlier up in the Great Lakes area. They couldn't tell the difference. He had that many fresh injuries. This lady is my Aunt Emma, and she married Fred. She was a miner's daughter from Alice, Colorado, up near the Blackhawk Central City Mining District. I'd heard about Emma. She was not from Arizona, like the family little, wrong information was. And she married my Uncle Fred and went to California. And she is actually, I'm not going to spend too much time on her, is pretty predominant in the book because she ended up being a labor organizer herself. And she's actually becoming even more and more known. And there were some surprises I found out about Emma as time went on. So I just want to share that with with you. Emma was part of the Fresno free speech fight. This particular fight lasted 2 years. This is the longest one that Frank was in, and it's probably his most important one. And in my opinion, this is the most important thing he did in his life, was this particular fight. They have a marker for it. For the first free speech fight in California. It's on a square in Fresno, California that they honor. It's being right now, it's gotten it to be in bad shape. They needed to redo some things. The street itself is gone. They've made this mall. And the night that I went to see it, we had been researching in the library near there, and we'd been on the microfilm machines, and there were only 2 machines. And I had a friend with me, and I knew if I got up from my chair, somebody else was going to get it. We did not eat. So we were starved, and at 5 o'clock, we asked the librarian, we said, well, where can we go eat down here? And she looked at us real funny. She goes, well, you mean down here? Yeah, where can we go eat? So she tells us of a restaurant that's way far away. No, down here. And I said, and I need to go take pictures of that plaque. You want to go take pictures of that plaque? I said, yes. So we're wondering what in the world is going on. And my friend lived in San Francisco, and so she's familiar with California, but even then she was taken back by this. So we got in the car. We drove around by where the mall where this particular plaque was. It was like the Night of the Living Dead. They have a homeless population in Fresno that is just downtown, but it's not that they're homeless. These people are, it's misery. I mean, they got the drugs and the bottles in paper, and they're sitting there, and they just all started moving. And she said, that plaque is over there. You can't walk over there. I'm not going to let you walk all the way over there. In the end, she just jumped over the curb. We drove the car. We drove up where that plaque was. We took the picture. There was a guy sitting on the bench, and he just kind of looked up to us and said, hey. I said, hey. Took my picture, and we left. But the irony of it is that when Frank was there, it was the same situation. They were there. There was this homeless population. The difference was they wanted to work. They were thrown out of work. And so he was organizing these laborers. He was organizing itinerant men. This is where the hobos came from. And I got a lesson on the difference between a hobo and a bum. I don't know if you've always probably thought they were the same, but they're not. A hobo was somebody who was thrown out of work, was looking for work, and could not find work. They were down on the worst situation, camped out in what they call jungles. A lot of them did drink. They ate whatever they could find, and they looked for jobs. The IWW would try to find them work. And what Frank did, he organized fruit workers in Fresno, California, in the San Joaquin Valley, 50 years before Cesar Chavez. Okay, so that's something also that I found out that who knew? Bums they didn't want to work. Okay, there's a difference. That's what I found the language that came from that, part of our culture from this hobohood, it's really remarkable and it's very interesting. And of course, then it feeds into the Great Depression, and when we really had a lot of people, hoboing and hopping on trains, going to find work or just to find something different if they could. But these people were thrown out of work. There was another panic in 1907. And they just lost their jobs. So it was misery. All right, I'm going to give you something a little bit more light because everything's kind of been dark. These are my great-grandparents. This is Lon and Ella Little. They were taking their pictures in Drumright. Drumright was the big boom in Oklahoma. Happened in 1914. They discovered the intercontinental oil field. It was the largest oil field in the United States. Not under our property, but it was the largest oil field in Oklahoma. Everybody went to Drumright. That's where the strike was. The Cushing Drumright field was there. And it's kind of like going to Cripple Creek or Butte. It's the same type of setup. They were all in a tent city first. And so let me do this for you real quick. And this is just a humor. And then I've been told I have to finish. I won't be able to do everything I want to do, unfortunately. This is what I hate. I lay down my glasses, and then I can't see where I laid them down because I can't see. Oh, there they are. Thank you. I see them. That's why I have a pair in every room in my house. Okay, according to family census, Lee Little was a mean man. Lee Little is my grandpa on the left. Okay, perhaps ornery is a better descriptor of the brawny young roughneck. In 1914, the eldest son of Lon and Ella Little absconded from Drumright, Oklahoma, leaving his job at the Drumright Cushing oil field gas field because of a foolish prank. The law, actually a loosely organized group of Drumright citizens, was looking to arrest Lee for damages, but Lee was headed for the state line because Kansas had oil fields too, all part of that same oil field. Lee's brother Glenn occupied his empty hours riding a small white mule simply called the Jackass, close to his parents' boarding house in Drumright. One day, Lee and another fellow caught the normally placid mule, and they squirted High Life, a flammable liquid used for fumigation and insect control, under its tail. Well, even adolescent boys knew that when the turpentine compound was poured on an unfortunate victim, the animal would come to life, illustrating the product's name in a way that the manufacturers surely never planned. The mule charged through the mostly tent town of Drumright, barging through a newlyweds couple's white tent, and was eventually found 20 miles away in Shrouded. By then, Lee had made it safely to Kansas. Meanwhile, the authorities, such as they were, waited for his return. But Lee was not the little in Drumright with a reputation for making trouble. By mid-March 1914, his uncle Glenn showed up to help unionize the town's oil workers. And in this particular chapter, there is the event that caused my family to zip their lips about Frank Little. And so I promised I would only talk until, so I'm not going to do any more readings. I want to do this real quick on 1917, and I won't do any more readings, but I want to give you this. This is a cartoon for IWW. IWW stood for various things during the time. Of course, it is industrial, not international, because it's industries. Industrial Workers of the World. Then it was I Won't Work. Then they thought they were bums. Remember what I told you about bums? So it was I Want Whiskey. And then, unfortunately, by 1916, a senator, Senator Amherst, renamed them Imperial Wilhelm's Warriors. And so when that happened, that changed things, very much so, because the government, Wilson said, we're not going to get you into the war, and then he got them into World War I. We had not been attacked, but we stood to lose a lot of money. There was a lot of money to be made. And the IWW, being who the IWW was, stood to impede them. So they started organizing the Mexicans in Arizona. And in the summer of 1917, my uncle had been just recently to to Oklahoma to visit his dying mother. He was beaten up in El Paso, had a double hernia. He had already had the injuries from Lake Superior in Superior just a few months before. And he was with this man, Grover Perry, and he was zigzagging back and forth, and he needed a hernia operation. And so this was what he was like before he went to Bisbee. And in fact, he was in such bad health that he was 5'11", and he weighed about 135 pounds. They said he was like a walking cadaver. So this happens. And the speculator mine blew on June 8th. My great-great-grandmother died on June 9th. My uncle didn't have time to mourn. The letter followed him all over Arizona before he finally got it. When they got into his valise in the boarding house in Butte, Montana, that letter was in there, notifying him. But what I found out, well, this I just love this. I'm sorry, I have to show this. Did y'all see this? They represent every one of the miners that died. They put the children in one of the mines in Butte. And this is, I think it's McMangus. He's the grandson of the guy who lived long enough to write the letters goodbye, and he saved people. He could have gotten out, and he didn't, and he perished. So they have his accounts, and every one of those kids is holding a candle in that mine representing. They did that for the centennial this summer. So what I found out was, these are new telegrams that I just found. I went into the Bureau of Investigation files, and when you look at them, he says, if you need me, I'll come. And he was hurt. So he kept going. He kept traveling all over. And now this had happened up here in Montana. The Arizona miners wanted to strike in solidarity with the Butte miners. And that was what was going on in Arizona. And Frank was saying, no, wait. We do it all together. We don't do it one group at a time. But you can see, he said, what we want a general strike for 6 hours. We want 6 days a week, $6 a day. 666, that's what we want. And so he's sending out these messages, and he's telling them, keep them there. Notice he's picking up his mail at the Shade Pool Hall. And then on this one, this is another one I found, and this was long after I'd finished the book, and the book was out. But this right here, send little. And so these telegrams were just flying all over Arizona. So what happens is, of course, up in Butte, Montana, they say, send little. And so he doesn't get his hernia operation. I also found out that all these people who had worked with him that I highlighted were spies. They were working as double agents with the mines, every one of them. In fact, there was one person who said he thought that probably 50% of the IWW were spies. And I would get into more detail on this. I don't have the time. And there they are again, so I'm just going to keep going. I went to the Centennial this summer. I spoke there. It was for the Bisbee deportation. And this is why my uncle had the bitter words that he had that was in the newspapers at Butte. They had planned it months in advance. They knew that these miners were going to go on strike. They wanted them to go on strike. Frank had just been there, had gotten in a car wreck, broke his ankle, leaving Bisbee, but he'd asked them, please don't strike yet. The minute he left, one of those spies that was highlighted a minute ago stirred them up so they would strike, because that's what the mining companies wanted. They wanted an excuse to go after them. They had had Gatling guns, machine guns, all kinds of rifles stockpiled for 2 months. They'd had enough time that they brought over British men to work as scabs in the mines. They had them in another hotel where they weren't supposed to talk. It was a secret. Only there were prostitutes in that house, so they were talking, and people kind of had an idea. And on July 12th at 6 o'clock in the morning, these men, all certain town members, got up. They arrested, or they pulled people out of their houses, shoeless, sockless, come on, you're going. 1,200 men, put them in the cattle cars that were owned by William Clark, and they drove them to Columbus, New Mexico. I followed that route this summer on the way there. In 112, 110 degree heat, 1 barrel of water per car, and left them there. They had closed their bank accounts so that their families could not get money. They had shut down the telegraph. They had blocked everybody coming in and out. So he was very, very bitter. He knew a lot of these people. He had lived and worked in Arizona for years. So I'm just gonna come to the end here. So when he does do his speaking at the ballpark, he is referring to this quite often. He's very bitter. He does not feel good. He has the broken ankle. He has all the injuries. And so what we get from him is that he's a traitor. They murder him. He's a traitor because of his speech, which they would have considered hate speech, right? And then, of course, he was honored. And we know at his funeral there were 10,000 viewers. It was the largest funeral in Butte history. I think Evel Knievel's was like a third that size. There were 3,000 participants in the funeral. The funeral took 30 minutes to pass every group of people. And I want you to look at this picture. Check out the granite pavement. When I see that, I just cringe because that's what he was dragged over. I want to show you this. Montana. William Campbell of the Helena Independent pushes for and gets the first Sedition Act, the state of Montana. It's the cookie cutter pattern that is used for the rest of the states, and finally the United States of America by spring. And you can't see that. I'm sure the red was probably not the color to use. But what it says is that under the Sedition Act, you are arrested if you utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, about the uniform of the Army, about the flag, about the Constitution. If you urge, incite, or advocate any curtailment of production in this country, they made it against the law to go on strike. Anything like that necessary to the prosecution of the war. That was the Sedition Act. Neighbors were turning in neighbors. If you spoke German to someone in a line, you were arrested. After Frank's death, if you had his picture in your pocket, you were arrested because this was the first count against them for conspiring with the late Frank Little. And that's why they were tried, the IWWs that were arrested. There was something called the Big Pinch. The Big Pinch happened September 5th, and just as my great-grandparents feared, arrest happened. My great-grandfather was arrested. His house searched and seized in Drumright, so the family immediately moved back to Yale. He was just a farmer. My Uncle Fred was in prison for about 5 months. Bessie kept the only photograph of Frank that no one knew existed until about 4 years ago, and that's him. And his eye was put out. He wore a glass eye in the pictures you've seen. His eye was put out because my great-grandfather was hitting a piece of wood. He was chopping wood and hit a metal stake, and it popped. Yeah. I like this. I want to end with this. This is from Helen Keller, and I'll let you read it if you can see it. I thought it was a great quote. It takes courage to steer one's course through a storm of abuse and ignominy when talking about Frank Little. He was born in 1878. I gave the eulogy this year that he never had, because it was all propaganda back in 1917, so I got to do the eulogy. And that was just this summer. And I thank you very much. You only missed 2 readings.